On today's episode of the Oks Podcast, I will be discussing first Ryan Hollins' take on First Take, then Patrick Beverley signing for the Bulls, and last but not least, what the Bulls should do with the seventh pick. Let's get right into the podcast. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first edition of the Oaks Podcast. And today I will be starting by discussing what happened on First Take today. So, Shaq and Ryan Hollins were on First Take today. And Ryan Hollins was trying to explain to Shaq why LeBron James was the GOAT. But even though I don't agree that LeBron James is the GOAT, that will be a podcast for a different day. He had the audacity to say that the Warriors would run circles around the Bulls, and that the reason why LeBron has a bad finals record is because the Bulls never had to face a team like the Warriors. Let's start off by saying that LeBron James lost to teams that were a lot worse than the Warriors and is kind of why he has a bad finals record. No one in their right minds would try to argue that the Mavericks team that beat LeBron when he was on the Heat was a superior team. They wouldn't say that the Spurs were a better team than the Bulls. And just because he played the last few times against the Warriors doesn't mean that every time he played a team that was far superior to him. The first time that LeBron lost was because of injuries. Yes, you could say that about why the Warriors lost this year, but injuries happen, and, well, that's just it. I would say, and I think most people would say, that the iteration of the Warriors that won in 2015 was nowhere near as good as the Jordan Bulls. So, in any of the 6 years that they won a championship, even most people would not. I would argue that the Bulls, the 6-time championship Bulls, any one of those teams is better than the 73 and 9 win Warriors team. Let's just look at the matchups. You have Ron Harper against Steph Curry. We're looking at this as if it was a playoff game, so I will also be taking that into consideration, how they play in the playoffs, in order to kind of compare the two teams. So, Steph Curry is clearly far better player than Ron Harper. Ron Harper is a defensive player, so he would be more in charge of making Curry not play as well as he should. And what we see from Curry is that Curry is not great in the playoffs, especially not in the finals. And that's the amount of pressure that he would have to beat the Bulls. He's just not as good in the finals and in the playoffs as he is in the regular season. I don't need to argue that. If you don't believe me, go look at the stats. His regular season stats are higher than his playoff stat, so there's no way that people can argue that Steph Curry is better in the playoffs than he is in the regular season. That's just facts. Then we go to the shooting guard position, where Klay Thompson would have to match up with Michael Jordan. And as we all know, Michael Jordan is better in all ways than Klay Thompson. Sure, Klay Thompson is a better three-point shooter, but I would say offensively and defensively, Michael Jordan is better. While Klay is a better shooter, Michael Jordan is just more dominant on the offensive end with the amount of things that he could do there. Sure, he was not a good three-point shooter, but if you hear some of the stories that have of Michael Jordan about how people said that he was a bad 3-point shooter. That's why Clyde Drexler was quote unquote better than him. He went out the next day and scored 9 3-pointers. So while Michael Jordan wasn't a good 3-point shooter, I think that was just more because he didn't want to be rather than because he wasn't able to shoot. Then we'll move on to the small forward position, and Scottie Pippen would run circles around Harrison Barnes. Offensively, defensively, Pippen was a far superior player. Then we move on to Draymond Green, who, in my opinion, is not that good. Like, sure, he gets you the rebounds, he gets you the assists, but the amount of errors that he makes, it's just ridiculous. He just look at these finals. In the last game, he had 8 turnovers. That is a ridiculous amount. Like, if you are an all-star, you should not be turning the ball over 8 times. That's just ridiculous. I mean, really, 8 turnovers, and it's not just one game. He had a lot of turnovers throughout the entirety of the series. He's just very turnover prone. So let's just look at the best Bulls team. We're obviously looking at the 73 win Warriors team, so let's look at the 72 win Bulls team. And Dennis Rodman is better than Draymond Green. You can argue that, but I'm going to say that Dennis Rodman was a better player. Sure, he couldn't shoot, but the amount of defensive rebound, the hustle, he is what Draymond Green is trying to be. He is trying to be Dennis Rodman. It's just like how Kobe tried to be MJ, but Kobe is not as good as the original. Just like in movies, the originals are usually better than the sequels, just like in this case. Then we go to the center position, which would be Festus Ezeli versus Luke Longley. As you could clearly tell, Festus Ezeli is no longer in the NBA. Sure, he was good with the Warriors that season, but I would not want to say that he or Longley would make that big of a difference in the game. It's not that big of a difference. Or even if you say Bogut, the centers for both the Bulls and the Warriors, I would say it wasn't great on either side. So then we look at the sixth man and we look at Iguodala versus Kukoc. And I'm sorry, but Kukoc he's a better sixth man. There's very few sixth men that were better than Tony Kukoc. I would probably only have 2 players in consideration for being a better sixth man than Tony Kukoc, and that would be Crawford, who is probably considered, most people in the modern era want him to own the Sixth Man of the Year trophy because of how good of a sixth man he was. And there's only one other player that I would say could rival Tony Kukoc, and that's Lou Williams. But both players have a little bit of a tendency to not be as good on the defensive end, so that's why I would say Tony Kukoc is the best sixth man. So if we look at the two teams, the Bulls won. Now, let's look at the most OP Warriors team, and that's with Kevin Durant. Again, Ron Harper versus Curry. We have one defensive point guard, one offensive point guard, but I would say that because of Curry being not great in the playoffs and Harper being a good defender, that he would be able to minimize the impact that Curry had on the game. Sure, Ron Harper at that time, obviously, Ron Harper in his prime was a good player, but when he came to the Bulls, he was not the same player. But he was still a great defensive player. he was not that much on offense. So I think that Curry would have probably gotten 20, 25 points a game, which is definitely a reasonable amount for Curry to have if Kevin Durant is not hurt. And obviously we saw in these playoffs that he averaged 30, and that's without KD and for for almost 2 games without Clay. And obviously that 47-point game really helped his average up a little bit. Then we look at Klay Thompson versus Michael Jordan. I mean, is there really a question? Is there really a question on who's better? Then we have KD versus Pippen. Pippen is a better defender, but Durant is a better overall player. Again, Dennis Rodman is better than Draymond Green, as I stated before. And then again, the centers are kind of, they're about equal. They usually didn't have that big of an impact in terms of the game. And then as soon as KD came into the Warriors, I would say that Iguodala, I mean, at all times, Iguodala is worse than Tony Kukoc. But it was very easy to see that as soon as KD came, Iguodala started to fall off. I think not because KD obviously played the position and they didn't really need him to play as much, but also because of the age factor. Obviously, he's getting older, he's getting injured, and all of these things. And obviously, I would say the Bulls probably had some better players on the bench too. Sean Livingston is widely considered the seventh man of their team. I would say Steve Kerr is a better player. I'm sorry, but Steve Kerr is a better player than him, and I don't think there's going to be much of an argument between that. So when Ryan Hollins tries to argue that the reason that LeBron James is the best player is because he didn't have to he had to play the Warriors and that he beat the Warriors is just dumb. It just is. Like, you can't compare those two things because the Bulls are the Warriors. The Bulls cannot play themselves. Now, let's go on to the second topic of today. Since I am a Bulls fan, sure, this might make my first part of this podcast seem a little biased, but I think most people would agree with most of the points that I had in there. But now let's move on to the second topic, and that's the fact that some Bulls fans are trying to argue that the addition of Patrick Beverley would not at all benefit the Bulls. Let's start by saying that Patrick Beverley is a better player than Chris Dunn. Putting Patrick Beverley in there would help Chris Dunn develop, as Chris Dunn is a very similar player to Patrick Beverley. Patrick Beverley is just a more experienced and less raw version. He's just a better, older version of Chris Dunn. Having him on the team will make Chris Dunn work harder because the last few years with the Bulls, there's only been one player that's been better than Chris Dunn at the point guard position for the Bulls, and that's Rajon Rondo. But because of Fred Hoiberg being such a bad coach, he benched Rajon Rondo, and for most of the season wouldn't put him back in the starting lineup. That gave Chris Dunn no competition. Obviously, he had that injury against the Warriors when he was starting to do good. I think the second season that he was traded to the Bulls, but he just never had any competition to go up against. He had no one to really push him to improve. So that's why you put in Patrick Beverley. Sure, he's not a huge upgrade, but he's better. And anyone who tries to start putting up stats and how if we compare the two stats, Chris Dunn had better statistics per 48 minutes than Patrick Beverley, you have to look at it this way. Patrick Beverley did not start for that team through the entirety of the season. He is also not the number one player on the team. He's not the number two player on the team. He's not the number three player on the team. He is maybe the fourth or the fifth best player on the team. He was also coming off a season where he didn't play at all, so obviously his stats this season were not going to be as good as he usually is, as I think he was coming off of a MCL tear where he had repairs for. So obviously he came back. This was the first full season that he had after coming back, and well, a player coming back from an injury usually needs a little bit longer to get into the swing of things as someone who played the entire season before. And then we have to realize that it would actually improve the Bulls team, because if we have Patrick Beverley, on the team, then we don't necessarily have to draft a point guard in this year's draft. I think that there is not anyone on that. I think that there's no one in the draft that would be better this year than Patrick Beverley. You sign Patrick Beverley to a 1-year contract. He's there for 1 year. He helps Chris Dunn develop. Obviously, Chris Dunn would be a great backup point guard for the team. You'd have him running the offense. He's a veteran. You can't just put together an entire team of young guys and expect them to do well. Obviously, they'll learn from their mistakes, but you need veteran leadership in the locker room. Otherwise, you're going to have exactly what happened last year, and a mutiny, because all 5 starters were all young guys who had very little experience when it came to the NBA. If it wasn't for Robin Lopez, there might have been a mutiny. You can't have only one veteran on the team. That's just not how the NBA is built. A championship team is not built off of young guys. If we look at the Raptors, they had two guys that were young, Pascal Siakam and Fred VanVleet. Everyone else was 27 years or older. If we look and go back in history, almost every single championship team, the best player on that team was 27 years or older. LeBron was 27 when he won his first championship. Curry was 27 when he won his first championship. KD was 27 when he won his first championship. Kawhi was 27 when he just won. But you can't win a championship with a bunch of young guys. Sure, that's building for the future, but it's just not going to happen. You need veteran players on the team in order to win a championship. And the reason why I'm saying that we shouldn't draft a point guard in this draft is because the next year draft is loaded with point guard talent. This year, we have to trade up to the 4th pick in order to get someone who's a talented point guard who I personally could see fitting decently well in with the Bulls and being better year 1 than Patrick Beverley, and that's Darius Garland. But the only way for us to do that is to trade up in the draft. Realistically, the only point guard that would be available for us to pick is Coby White. But Coby White is a score-first point guard. I personally think that he would be better as offensively as a 2 guard, but obviously, he's a little too small to defend the 2, and it wouldn't really work if he played the 2, but I think that he's just not a point guard. He's not what you usually think of as a point guard. He's not that great at running the offense. He's not a great facilitator, but obviously he's a great offensive player, and he's obviously very talented, but he as well would not be, in my opinion, the point guard of the Bulls' future. So if we can't get the point guard of the Bulls' future, why not take a flyer on a player who would help the team improve? He's a veteran in the locker room, which will obviously something that the Bulls need, and he plays with heart, and that's something that every NBA team needs, and that's just what we need is more veterans and more people who we know will play hard for the team. Now, on to my last topic, which will be who the Bulls should select with the 7th pick in the NBA draft. Obviously, the Bulls need a point guard, but as I had stated in my previous segment, there isn't really one available in this draft at the 7th pick. I do not think that it is worth risking trading up because Darius Garland only played 5 games. I do think that he has a lot of potential from the 5 games that he played, but we should not put our chips in the basket for a guy that didn't play that many games. Sure, people can say that that's what Kyrie Irving did, but Kyrie Irving was just a completely different player. He was clearly the number one selection even before, it's the draft started. Darius Garland was not projected to be the number one pick at any point in time, so you can't really compare those two players. Now, the only point guard that would be available is Kobe White, and as I said before, he's more of a shooter and not that great of a facilitator. And since we have Zach LaVine, Lauri Markkanen, and Otto Porter as 3 reliable scorers, do we really need another scorer who can't facilitate on the team? That would leave us with only one really player who doesn't need touches. Everyone else on the team is a scorer, and we need someone who's not a scorer first player. Sure, you could say that Otto Porter is a 3-and-D player. That is true, but Zach LaVine is not. Lauri Markkanen is not. He's a scorer. That's just the way it is. So I would say that with the 7th pick, you take a flyer on Cam Reddish. Sure, he played awful at Duke, and that's just what happened. Playing behind RJ Barrett and that Duke team, RJ Barrett and obviously Zion Williamson, obviously his stats weren't good, but he has the intangibles there. He's long, he's athletic, he's shown that he can shoot, he can facilitate. It's like, players have bad seasons. Sometimes, players just are bad. And obviously, he had to play. He went from being, obviously, in high school, the man. He was obviously the best player on any team that he was ever on. And then he went from being number one to not being number one to not even being number two to being number 3, and then sometimes it was actually number 4 with Jones, because Jones obviously was a point guard, so he ran the offense. So it was just a wake up call, and obviously I think that he is a lot. I would say he's more raw than a lot of these other players, but the Bulls have nowhere to rush. But I think he has a very high ceiling. I think that he might have as high of a ceiling as even RJ Barrett. I don't think he has as high of a ceiling as Zion. Zion has, obviously his ceiling, if to most people, is being Michael Jordan, or not Michael Jordan, sorry, LeBron James. But, obviously his ceiling is higher. RJ Barrett, most people are saying that he's DeMar DeRozan. And I think that that Cam Reddish is a much bigger version of Tracy McGrady. Sure, Tracy McGrady didn't win a championship, but I think that if you had taught Tracy McGrady how to play, just like how to play with a team a little bit more, maybe put him on a, you know, with with kind of build around him, he would have won championships. In my opinion, Tracy McGrady is one of the most talented basketball players of all time. Sure, he didn't win anything, but obviously talent doesn't always get you wins, as you can tell. Obviously, LeBron James right now is the most talented player. He didn't win. It's not all about having the best player or having the most talented player. It's about having the most well-rounded team. And having Cam Reddish coming off the bench as the sixth man, or eventually, you know, inserting him in the starting lineup, maybe even trying Zach LaVine at the one, Otto at the two, and him at the three. Obviously, that doesn't sound very good, but hey, I mean, you never know this summer what happens. Because I think that Otto Porter obviously is too big to play the two, but I mean, KD's too big to play the three. I mean, sorry, Giannis and LeBron and Ben Simmons are too big to play the one, to play the point guard position, but they do. So I think it would be okay to have Otto Porter play that position because I think that he would be able to defend the two pretty well. So because of that, it just makes sense for us to take Cam Reddish. But there's also speculation that Cam Reddish might be taken earlier. I think that if Cam Reddish and Darius Garland are off the table, I really think the Bulls should just trade the seventh pick. Realistically, those two are the only players at the 7 that I would want like on the Bulls team. There are obviously players later in the draft like Bol or players, other players, but obviously I think that maybe if we traded down, got the 15th pick and Bol was available at the 15th pick, that Bol would be a decent risk at the 15th pick because obviously he has a lot of potential, but at the 7th pick is just too early. So really, if Cam Reddish and Darius Garland are off the board, I really think that the Bulls should just trade that pick, whether that's for a player or for future picks, or maybe the Boston Celtics want to trade up, or however the trade goes. I just personally would not recommend for them to trade up to get Darius Garland because of the so many what ifs with him. He's not worth giving up what people are saying that needs to be given up in order to get the fourth pick in order for it to happen. So I wouldn't trade up if I were the Bulls. I would trade the 7th pick, maybe get a future first round pick, maybe get a point guard. I don't know. I obviously would wait to see how the draft plays out a little bit, see the first 4, 5 picks, maybe make a trade with a contingency that if Darius Garland is on the board, that the trade doesn't happen, or if if both Cam Reddish and Darius Garland are off the board, the trade doesn't happen. Obviously, I'm not a GM. I don't know exactly if that's possible, but if I were the Bulls, I would obviously try doing that. But thank you for listening to my first ever podcast. My next podcast should be coming out in a few days. I will try to have another podcast with my full mock draft. That will be um, a different podcast with my friend Amir Ubid. And till next time, see ya.